Titled Indian Women Writing in Urdu and Other Indian Languages, and we have on the panel Nazia Akhtar, who some of you who follow HLF online may have already encountered. She has a book called Bibi's Room, Hyderabadi Women in the 20th Century and 20th Century Urdu Prose, which really offers some very interesting insights on the lives of women in Hyderabad in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So Nazia, may I ask you to come up on the dais? So Nazia teaches English and Russian literature at in IIT Hyderabad, IIT Hyderabad. I always get confused between those two institutions. IIT Hyderabad. And of course, apart from being a writer. In conversation with Nazia, we have Qadeer, who teaches in the Department of English at the University of Delhi. He has been a visiting scholar at Potsdam University, and he has been engaged both in literary critique as well as in translation. So Haris will be in conversation. And in moderating the discussion will be Farhan, who many of you may know as from Lamakan. And Farhan has very kindly agreed to step in at the last minute because Asma, who was supposed to moderate this discussion, has not been able to be here. But Farhan is, of course, an old Hyderabadi and very familiar with the subject, so I'm sure it's going to be a great discussion. So you have about 40 minutes, and we can also open it up to audience questions after their discussion.
Hello. I'm a last minute substitute here because Asma is here, but her phone is off, like it should be. But the unfortunate problem with that is that she can't be called in here. So, this session is going to be interesting, and I've been looking forward to this session, both with Nazia and Haris. Very briefly, both of them are engaged with women's writings, specifically with Muslim women's writings in India. And just before we start, a very quick question to both of you. I'll start with Haris. What prompts you to do what you're doing? How do you arrive here?
Thank you, Farhan. Trained as a professor of English, I teach the English department. But yet, it's more like my personal experience also. I've been, seeing women in my family, and how you see how women are representing specific women, Muslim women, as youth victim of patriarchy, which was not the case. That persuaded me to, perhaps explore the question of Muslimness of women and rethink the whole idea of, how they're navigating between the world of silence and voices. And in fact, that is why if you look at the title of my story, book, it's called The Silence That Speaks. So instead of giving voice to women, because as a man I can't give voice, and I'm not at all claiming to give voice to Muslim women, rather I'm questioning the silence that is surrounding them. So the title of my book, which Oxford University has published, it's called The Silence That Speaks. So I am basically, questioning the silence that is there, and perhaps how Muslim women, through their narrative, they are resisting to it. Moreover, I'm not just focusing on life writing, to be more precise, because when you look at life writing, there is a lot of research already available. Scholars here in India and abroad, they have been writing on life writing. But I am perhaps looking at fiction idea, how they use the genre of fiction, the space of fiction, to talk about their identity, their self, but through self they are also talking about the society. So that is how I would respond to it.
Okay. And Nazia, your trajectory has been a little different, right? And it's specific to women writers of Hyderabad. Okay. And it also has to do with your personal experience of immersing yourself in Hyderabad, right? So, how do you come about to write this book?
Okay, so I think Harris's the idea of silence really is actually a very comfortable segue for me as well, because it started off from that point, right? I mean, so to kind of put both of these things together, I had an interest in Hyderabad, the literature and the history and culture of Hyderabad, because I was working on the transfer of power in the context of Hyderabad. And because in that, I found myself drawn to women's experiences, which, as you would know, is a big, is a big aspect of partition studies. So as I found myself drawn to that, my conversations with Hyderabadis, such as yourself, for example, led me to writings written by women, right? And so all of a sudden, there were all of these people telling me about women in their families, women in their neighborhoods, aunts they knew, cousins who lived once upon a time, who had written various things, right? And it struck me, then this question of silence, it struck me then why we don't know anything about these women writers, right? Why is it that there is a 150-year-old tradition of Hyderabadi women writing in Urdu in all genres of fiction as well as all genres of non-fiction, and I'm not even talking about poetry, I'm only talking about prose, and we don't know anything about it, right? So at that point, I mean, recently Reema Abbasi, for instance, has translated Wajidat Tabassum's short stories, but before that, I mean, there were just 2 or 3 things that were translated. The the very good translations by Zakia Mashhadi of Jilani Bano's work, for instance, no one really knew about, right? So, that just it. And as I've spent the last 10 years in Hyderabad, immersing myself in this tradition, in the literature and history and culture of this place. So I think, growing into that and realizing how much there was, as I learned and I grew as a person and as a woman and as a female scholar working on gender and working on women's lives and histories, I think this book just was an organic reality in some ways. It was going to happen in any case. It just came about like that.
It often happens with investigative books like this, that you start with a theory, right, of something, and then when you arrive, it's not that, it's something else. So what was the discovery you made in the process of this book? And are there any special authors that you would like to see?
Yes. Thank you, Farhan. Yes, and I think that will also add to what I've already said. Now, if you look at this specific book, I'm also trying to trace a literary history, and this is what Nazia is doing in Hyderabad context. Although I must tell you, I also have a couple of stories, scholars, authors from Hyderabad in the book. So, Hyderabadis must be very happy. There are, Jailani Bano is there in my book also. Wajida Tabassum is also part of the book. But, I was also, looking at when I started working on Muslim women writing almost a decade back. In fact, I run a course, also MPhil course at Delhi University on Muslim women's writing in India. Now, I also found that, there is a scholarship on how Muslim women are represented by others. But as Nazia has already said, there is very few how they are trying to represent themselves. So this whole idea of I becomes very important, the personal I. It is through the life narrative, and it's also how you're fictionalizing self. Another thing which is, I think I forgot to answer, was regarding, I'm not just looking at Urdu, and perhaps this is, I think, one of the points that I'm making. Because there is so much interrelationship between Urdu and Muslim identity, as if there's nothing outside. Yeah. So there are, in fact, there are authors from Telugu, and I also found, authors writing in Meghalaya. There are Muslim women who are writing about their Muslim identity in a small village of Garo Hill. There are Muslim women who are writing in Assam. There are Muslim women, yes, Nagaland. So, in fact, my book, if you look, it has stories from almost 12 to 15 languages, and I'm very happy. I mean, I have not translated them. I mean, it really was you know, an ambitious project where people came together, and then, so this is one of the discovery that I found, that if you want to understand the whole idea of Muslimness, we also need to, you know, debunk this myth of this Urduized identity, which is definitely imposed on us. I'm not at all saying that Urdu is not part of identity, it's a very important part, but then women, and just one more thing, you know, this last year, in fact, 2022, and in fact, in this book, I start from early 20th century, and Sultana Dream is the first story that I use, which is very popular. But I also found that there were various women journals in 19th century, late 19th century, and early 20th century. I mean, there were more than 3,000 Urdu journals that were there, but nobody knows about them. So in British library,
some of them were also published from
Yes,
Hyderabad.
yes, a lot.
We happen to have
exactly. I mean,
have a full.
Yes. Hyderabad, Aligarh, Lucknow, Rampur. There are places. But what I'm trying to say, apart from that, what I found very interesting, and this was later when I already submitted this manuscript, in my British library, I was working at the archives on print culture regarding my another project. I also found that in late 19th century, there were Muslim women who were writing in English and publishing them. And this journal, which I can't name because it's part of my research, it's very interesting where how editor is saying that, you know, if we want women, if we want, you know, a developed society, we need to give women certain space. I know there might be problem in giving space, but think about this is late 19th century. And then this journal is publishing, you know, English stories. There are translations also. So this is something remarkable that I found.
Nazia, I mean, this brings me, this backgrounds two questions for me. One is the question of 47 itself, right? And associated with that is a question of partition. Because in the Muslim psyche, it's not freedom, it's a partition, right? I mean, in daily conversations, we talk about partition se pehle, partition se baad, right? So, have you, you know, in your writings, you know, tried to functionalize this, tried to, you know, investigate or, you know, interrogate the question of nationhood or identities, you know, of the feminine being reflected in you know, what the nation was going to become in the process of, you know, 20th century. I mean, did you get any sense of that in your work?
Yes, I did, and I keep going back to keep going back to Jilani Bano here, so I will have to. This will be a little personal for you as well. But yes, I think apart from the research that I've done in this book, there are other women writers that I look at in the context of Hyderabad, and my research is mainly on Hyderabad. So the question of the transfer of power, I look at through the lens of Hyderabad, which I think is very important, because for a very long time, when we talk about the transfer of power, by which I mean partition and all the events surrounding that in the years before and after, we have to, I think, recenter, refocus, perhaps decenter the northern bias, and also talk about what was happening in the south, right? And in places such as Hyderabad, where the whole landscape was transformed, where this whole polity, you know, underwent drastic changes and was never the same again, right? So not only places that were cartographically cut up, but those that were absorbed into the body of the nation, right? So so when I look at I'll come to the writers that I talk about in Bibi's Room in a second, but beyond that, the research that I've done, for instance, on Huma Qidwai's novel, The Hussaini Alam House, right, or even Samina Ali's novel, Madras on Rainy Days, you know, they talk, both are written by women, about women at the center of this, and talk about the particular kind of fragmentation and silences surrounding this question in the Hyderabad context, because what happened to Hyderabad was different but completely embedded in the context of partition.
So, I mean, you took three authors to, you know, to basically highlight and, you know, weave the conversation around them. There are others like Qidwai, etc., but, you know, there are three ones. So, Haris, your canvas is a little bigger, right? So, how many authors have you covered?
This is 38, but I know I had list of 50, but you know, when you are putting together a book, you know, there are various logistical challenges, rights, translation rights, permission. So I could only get 38, so there are 38, but I can talk about more. But yes, Farhan, I think very interesting question when you're looking at this nomenclature of partition versus freedom. And let me also mention it is not, I mean, I slightly disagree, I'm sorry. Okay. No, when you look at, you know, the idea of partition in Muslim society, I think this whole idea of partition versus freedom, there are theorists. I'm reminded of Gyanendra Pandey when he talks about partition. He says this is post-partition, this is not independent but post-partition India. So you know, there are theorization and there are people who are specifically looking at the broader idea. The second thing, partition in Muslim women, yes, it's a very important question. And you know, Siobhan Lambert, and there are other, there is someone more recently, Ali, sorry, I can't recall the name. She also emphasizes this point that, you know, when you look at 1990s, when there is so much interest in partition scholarship, specifically from the point of view of gender, there is this one voice that is missing, that is the voice of Muslim women. It is not so that Muslim women have not written about the partition. Right. So there is complete silence on that also. In fact, in my book, I have a couple of, you know, texts which specifically talks about partition. But, you know, if you, because I mentioned that, you know, I couldn't, you know, use all the materials that I had. But yes, you know, Nazia has made a very important point regarding this North-centric partition studies approach, which I think one needs to understand how, you know, partition was affecting. And let me tell you now, people are also working on Assam and partition and other. Anyway, so coming back to this idea, Anis Kidwai, if you look at Azadi Ki Chhaw, in the shadow of freedom. And then there are short stories like, you know, a story like by Usman Chugtai, which is Jari, which has this reference to, you know, even film script that she wrote. I mean, I'm talking about Sathiu's Garam Hawa. The script was written by Smart, you know, there is, she's looking at what you call as long shadow of partition. Partition not just as an event, but it is a process which is still affecting us. You know, we can't just look at partition as an event that happened. And, I mean, think about all the long shadows of partition in everything that we have. So, you know, the everyday lived lives of a common human being in this subcontinent and how partition affects it. Yes, there are stories that specifically deal with this whole idea of marginalization, othering, you know, when you become stranger in your own land. So these are some of the themes of the stories that I found. But unfortunately, I could not use everything in my book because there was serious limitation. But yes, there is enough available. And in fact, you know, I'm also reminded, since you are interested in Hyderabad, I mean, in fact, while on my flight, I was reading this very interesting text by Mohammadi Begum, which has recently been translated, a long way away from Hyderabad, where she is also discussing pre-partition politics. She's at Oxford. I mean, just imagine a Muslim woman from 1930 moving from Hyderabad to study in Oxford. There are various examples. And right now, in fact, I told you I'm working on print culture now. I found that in early 20th century, there were various women who were moving to Oxford, Leeds for their higher education. And think about, you know, how we still are, you know, stuck up with debate of how Muslim women are just reduced to a mute victim of patriarchy. I mean, I know that image is changing, but still we need to rethink this whole idea of representation.
Right. You know, is there any discovery you made in terms of authors that you might want to, you know, read out from your book? So that we can...
Unfortunately, I don't have a book right now. Yes. Yeah, I don't have a copy of the book right now. Okay. Yeah, so because it was quite heavy and then I was like traveling from somewhere else, so I couldn't. Okay. But I think Nazia would read up and then I can.
Yeah. So if there's some excerpt that, you know, that sort of, you know, frames this conversation that you can, you know, get from your book.
Yes, one would be really interesting to look at various geographies like these landscape, these secular as well as sacred landscape that Muslim women talk about in their work, and specifically how the position of both public and private, it is redefined as far as gender is concerned. So you have Muslim women visiting mosques and then, you know, noticing how men are not part of that mosque. And I'm reminded of Anis Jung's, travel diaries. So there is enough on which, women are looking at these positions, these spaces, and how questioning the spaces that they occupy in society, one thing. The second, they are also, perhaps by doing so, they're also trying to talk about how this whole concept of private, public, when you look at Islam, it is very relative. It is not fixed. In fact, if you look at the whole idea of Sharia, that might be controversial. When you see that they also trying to talk about this, and someone like Asma Barlas, who is also questioning this whole idea of how do you define Muslim women, even when you look at from the religious perspective or from the perspective of language.
I was, while Haris was speaking about the division between public and private, I was actually thinking of a woman writer whom I've now started working on, from Hyderabad, who's not in this book, but who is just, who exemplifies all of these conversations, this whole discussion that we're having, who is Sughra Humayun Mirza.
Right.
She is a great example of, a woman who completely defies these stereotypes. So she was, just to give a little bit of context to everyone, so Sughra Humayun Mirza was a journalist and author. She's probably the first woman novelist in Urdu from Hyderabad. She's known to have written 14 novels, out of which a few survived. She was a poet who wrote with the Takhallus Haya. She was a traveler. She traveled across Europe, across large parts of Asia, across India, and wrote many travelogues, some of them in several volumes. At the time, they were published as small articles in her journal, which she started. So she was a journalist, an author, a poet, a novelist. She was also an educator and a reformer, which was her primary role. And so, when she's traveling across Europe, there are these 2 volumes in which she has meticulously documented everything that she sees across Europe. And she spends about a month in Germany because her husband was getting some really important medical treatment there. And this is a woman who wears a full burqa, so, and she kind of adapts her clothes according to where she is. So she's wearing this full, full European dress, a blouse and, a kind of waistcoat or a jacket kind of thing on top of that, a full skirt, high heels, stockings, and a full veil up till here covering her face. She traveled like that across Germany, across, across England, across, I think the Netherlands as well, where she remarked, the first thing she said about the Netherlands is, this place is ruled by a woman. That's the first thing she said. And, the way she negotiates space is very interesting. The poetics of space, this woman observing parda, the things she observes, the way the encyclopedic detail she provides about these places, the insights, the analysis she provides completely defeats all these stereotypes that we have of Muslim women from this time. This is a woman who's doing this in the early 1920s, right? And there's this whole, there's this whole aspect of her writing about Europe, which also inverts the colonial gaze, which inverts this very, objectifying and, kind of completely dismantles that gaze that the white European man has when it comes to women in the East. The gaze that Edward Said talks about in Orientalism, in his famous book Orientalism, completely inverts that gaze, turns it on its head, and does something very radical with it. Here is this, very intelligent woman, a journalist, a writer, thinking and talking about the Germans in between the wars. This is a very critical period when she's there in the 20s and the 30s, between the 2 world wars, and talking about Germany as a nation. So, Siobhan Lambert Hurley, in her recent book, 3 Centuries of Muslim Women Travelers, has talked about how these Muslim women travelers defeat all those, stereotypes of, silent, oppressed, women in the East, forget whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim or whatever, but, in need of rescuing, in need of, recovery or rehabilitation. She completely defeats that stereotype.
It reminded me of Leela Abu Laud's 2 Muslim women need saving. Yeah, exactly. So this whole idea of saving Muslim women is something that, people have been talking about if you look at Western literature, or in fact, how contemporary discourses, they also, resonate these ideas. But how were given in late 19th century, early 20th century, and now Muslim women are discovering. They're completely debunking this myth of a stereotype identity. The second, Nazia, I think it would be really interesting to think about the whole idea of choice. How women are talking about their choice. So there's a very interesting story about a lady in my book who is parda wearing, and she's courageous, and she doesn't want to give birth. She says that this is my choice and I can do anything wearing. There is another story about women who doesn't like parda, and parda is imposed. So you can also see how there are questions regarding the whole idea of choice of Muslim women, the whole idea of agency of women. I think this question of agency becomes a very important part when you look at Nazia's work, when you look at my work, or in fact when you look at Siobhan Lambert's initial work. So the question of choice, agency becomes very important, because what you see in discourses, it is women without agency. And now when you analyze them, they are perhaps emphasizing their agency, that we have a lot of agency. And perhaps how the agency is expressed, that is perhaps we have to understand.
For example, if you look at Wajda Tabassum's work, for people who are not familiar with her work, Wajda Tabassum was this short story writer from Hyderabad, and she wrote short stories. Probably, Nazia will be able to better put it in words, but her famous stories was an intersection of female sexuality with caste, and at that time they were supposed to be extremely, they were actually called obscene literature. As a result, the people who were researching and documenting, and Urdu academicians completely ignored her works. And then it's now left to the new generation of Urdu research scholars to retrieve those kind of things. Or even if you look at gender ambivalent people like Begum and others who who tried pushing these caste gender boundaries around. But Nazia, I'd just like to take an abrupt break and ask you to read something from your book, right? Which probably will set the context here.
Okay. Well, I didn't prepare anything because I wasn't sure of, but I was just wondering if I can read from Zeenat Sajida's Agar Allah Miyan Aurat Hote, my translation of that. If you can just give me a second, let me just...
Meanwhile, Nazia, meanwhile you're thinking, I think he has raised a very important question regarding class, and there's this one story that is part of my book. It is called Zakat, and it explores this whole idea of gender, sexuality, and caste. And in fact, this whole idea of class becomes important, and I'm reminded of class because when you look at all these women, contemporary women or 20th century women, we often talk about women who are educated. But I must tell you, there are documentation how women, like in late 19th century, they were traveling. I mean, when we look at travel writing, we specifically talk about the higher class Begums traveling. But recently I came across this very interesting example from Sir Sayyid's travelogue, Safarnama London, which has been translated as Voice to Modernism. Sir Sayyid talks about this ayah who is from Kanpur, a Muslim ayah, who has traveled to, by that time she has traveled to almost all the countries. That was her 21st travel to Europe. So and she spoke English. That again is interesting. She's an unlettered woman from lower class, but because of the need, she learned English and she's traveling. She's also identifying herself as Muslim. So this is quite interesting when you look at these archives, when you found these words.
Yeah.
So I am going to read from my translation of Agar Allah Miyan Aurat Hote, If Allah Miyan Were a Woman. This is an essay written by a writer called Zeenat Sajida, who wrote these non-fiction essays. And which were meant to be taken as light sketches, but she manages to discuss some things that are, really fundamental and actually quite serious. So this is her reflecting on the gender of God, right? The names with which we remember God are all masculine, although God has no gender. Still, we usually address God with the masculine gender. We unconsciously commit this sin. Who says that God is a man? God is but divine will. It is a transgression on the part of men that they use the masculine mode and in this way try to prove that God sides with them. What if God actually sides with women? Who knows? Maybe God is herself a woman. Toba Toba, I began to think. I'll be in so much trouble if anyone hears this. A fatwa against blasphemy will be issued. Amma will wholeheartedly swear at my college education. She will curse the devil, and the whole family will thumb its nose at her and say, "Oh, Bibi, did we not say that it is not right to educate girls? She tries to compete with men in everything. Now face the consequences of your actions. She has even abandoned faith now. She belongs neither to faith, nor to the world, nor even to Khwaja Bande Nawaz." I'm going to read another short paragraph. It's just one paragraph. Which is, after she makes the argument that God is not only a woman, but if motherhood is supposed to be the highest fulfillment of not only womanhood but humanity, then God must be a mother. And that therefore the status of mothers and motherhood must be recognized, right? Because we celebrate motherhood, but we forget about the women who are actually mothers, right? So she says, so God is definitely a mother, not a father. And in any case, he himself says that heaven lies under the feet of a mother. Heaven, thoughts of which make the mouths of mullahs and men water, where there will be tall, multi-storied palaces made of pearls and coral, where alcohol and beauty will flow together, and there may be beautiful hoors too. Heaven, in quest of which they wear out their heads in prostration, for the sake of which their foreheads become marked. That very heaven is under the feet of a mother, in the dust kicked up by a woman's tread. Heaven belongs to God. God is a mother, a woman, and wants to give the heaven of her creation to those who understands mothers and recognizes their status.
Really nice. We have time for a couple of questions, if there are any. If someone would like to, ask a couple of questions, we'll, pass probably a. Yeah, someone asking a question. Yeah.
Is there a question? Someone in the back, I think, had a.
I have one. Thanks, Farhan and Nazia. For the first time, I heard that there is some recorded material about Madam Chugra Humayun Mirza. Sabdarea Girls High School, which actually is one of the institutions that she set up way back in 1911, has had the good fortune of both Rabindranath Tagore and Sarojini Naidu guiding that entire story. I was just wondering that they have a very lovely and old library where some part of her poems have been actually recorded and kept. Is there any work underway at your end to research, and maybe in one of the future literary fests next year, we could possibly also have more details about what she has done amongst the various ladies, as well as the the literary works that have been uncovered by great work by scholars like you. Is anything underway, or is there anything else that you could share?
So I am working on her work at but at the moment I'm focusing on prose. My area is primarily prose, but I do intend to also read her, of course, because the picture isn't complete without her poetry, and some of her poetry contains her sharpest critiques again of gender and society, and middle class hypocrisy, all of the kinds of questions that make her a great reformer and someone who was really committed to changing things for the better. As far as the second part of your question is, if you're inviting me for next year's festival, I'm definitely available to talk about Sugra Humayun Mirza anytime.
So
It was lovely to hear about all the research and everything, but I was wondering, when you say woman, is there space for queerness or transness? And I'd like to hear if there is time about it.
Yeah, that's a very, tell you, there are Muslim women who are perhaps talking about this whole idea. I'm thinking of Nikhat Gandhi. I don't know if you have read Alternative Reality. There's a very interesting chapter where she is perhaps thinking about the idea of queerness and idea of, same-sex relationship, and then looking at the idea of Muslimness. So there is one couple which is very interesting, Quratul N, and her partner is Nusrat. They're called QT and N. So they are, living alone in Pakistan. And, in fact, it's very interesting description where, again, this is not from my book, so this is from another book, where Nikhat Gandhi is talking, and she also identifies herself as someone who has close connection with Hyderabad. She says that, perhaps we have to think about this whole idea of relationships and then Islam, and perhaps how Islam is tolerant to these ideas. So yes, there are scopes when you look at more recent writings.
I can also answer that. So at this time, so the three writers that I talk about in this book are at the peak of their writing, roughly writing between the 1940s to about the 1970s. Jilani Banu continues to write beyond that. Najma Nikhat also writes a little bit beyond that. But Zinat Sajida, from whose work I just read, I mean, this essay is quite a gender bender in its own way. And so what you find with these writers writing at this particular time is that you find questions, you find attempts to question the binary, the gender binary, along, in very coded ways. Because it's not, so for example, Zinat Sajida wrote a story about a love triangle between one man and two women. And she, in the introduction to that collection of stories, she talks about how it was based on an experience that she had with two other women. But she felt that people would get the wrong idea. So she, quotes this and changes that and kind of suitably, self-censors in order to, make it palatable to the audience of the time. But, Wajida Tabassum, whom Farhan Saab just mentioned, does very interesting things with gender, Of course, she talks about deep and strong and fierce homosocial bonds between women, but I think there is scope to read some of those stories as something else and something more. But apart from that, I mean, if you go a little, Haris was talking about coming a little further in time. I'm going to talk about going a little back in time. When you read, the poetry of 18th and 19th century Hyderabadi courtesans like Mahlaka by Chanda or Lutfun Nisa Imtiaz, I mean, they're doing things which we would consider radical and shocking by our standards today when it comes to, I mean, the great thing about the Urdu ghazal is that the gender of the beloved is ambiguous, right? So the way Mahlaka Bai plays with that is just, it's magnificent. I mean, she takes even that to a new level, right? So you have those, there are, I mean, if I, now I'm getting really carried away, but if you think about the poetry of, and the whole life of Ibrahim Adil Shah II of Bijapur, who was the Sultan of Bijapur, his whole life questioned gender binaries in his time, but also, by our standards today. I mean, I could go on about this for some time. I am still searching for, women writers from Hyderabad at all periods of time, across all periods of time, who are doing such things. I'm always on the alert looking for these questions of queerness and quote-unquote other identities.
Yeah, and also, Nazia, if I may add, I mean, there are, as you've already pointed, if you look at a story like Sultana's Dream, how it critiques the heteronormative frame of gender. So that, and you have enough there. So one needs to do research.
Yeah. We have Subhatul Marjan here. She's a writer and poetess. Maybe, she has something to add here. Oh, there's a mic there. I mean, she's been writing for a while, so probably, I mean, she's been...
मेरा नाम सुबतुल मरजान है और मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि ये मौका जो है वो उसकी रूह जो है उसको मैं रिप्रेजेंट कर सकती हूँ। तो बातें हो रही हैं कि एक औरत की आवाज़ का होना, औरत की सियासी सोच का होना, औरत के अपने वजूद की अहमियत का जानने वाला होना, राइट। औरत के व्यूज़ सियासी भी हो सकते हैं, फिर उसके रूमानी भी हो सकते हैं। तो इन तमाम चीज़ों को मैं 2-3 नज़मों में पेश करूँगी आपके सामने।
Actually, we have time just for one because the other session is about to start.
I'll start with
just
one.
Yeah.
मुझसे उम्मीद ये करते हैं कि खामोश रहूं, कल्ब से खून की बारिश हो तो खामोश रहूं, हर तरफ आहो बका फिर भी मैं खामोश रहूं, अनछुई कलियों को रौंदा जाए, मुझ पे ये जुल्म है फिर भी कि मैं खामोश रहूं, बस्तियां सारी उजाड़ी जाएं, खौफ और ख़तर के इन वीरानों में बस्तियां फिर से बसाई जाएं, हाकिमे वक्त के हाथों में सजे हो खंजर और मेरे हाथों के फूलों को भी मसला जाए, मुझ पे ये जुल्म है फिर भी कि मैं खामोश रहूं। I think I'm allowed to recite one.
Yeah, no, there's some other questions that we'll take, and then, I don't know, because we're already out of time. I think, do we have time or are we out of time now? I'm not sure, because Usha's been... Do we have time or are we done?
I think we'll have to wrap up.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought so.
I mean, of course, there's space outside, and I would encourage people to go and chat with them after the session.
Sure.
But we do have to.
Yeah, so will you both be at Meet the Book here? Yeah, so they are headed to Meet the Book. You can pick up their books. They are available right here in the bookstall, and they'll be available for signing. Thank you so much. Shukriya.